Hi everyone and welcome back to my channel. My name is Your Name and today you're going to hear a really hard and shocking story that has rocked the world. If you're new here, please be sure to subscribe and turn on the bell so you don't miss any more true crime videos. Today we're going to talk about a case that has come to symbolize one of the most horrific child abuse cases in modern history, the Turpin family. This case came to light in January 2018 in Paris, California, and when the media started covering it, people around the world couldn't believe their eyes. How is it even possible that in the 21st century, in an ordinary house in a quiet neighborhood, 13 children could live in such conditions? David and Louise Turpin kept their children, ranging in age from 2 to 29, in captivity, isolated from the outside world. These children suffered from extreme malnutrition, were physically chained and lived in conditions unimaginable to the average person. Neighbors had no idea what was going on behind the closed doors of this house, and if it weren't for the courage of one brave girl, this story may never have come to light. In today's video, I take you through the entire case from start to finish, from life in captivity, to the dramatic escape, to the trial and the punishments the parents eventually received. Get ready, because this story is really hard but also extremely important. It will show us how crucial mindfulness is, and the courage to intervene when something is not right. So get comfortable, and let's dive into the Turpin family case. All right, now we come to the players in this case. Who exactly were David and Louise Turpin? What were their lives like before they became parents? And what did the family structure actually look like? Let's take a closer look. I'll start with David Allen Turpin, who was born on October 17, 1961, in Virginia. David grew up in what we might call a relatively standard American middle-class environment. His family was deeply religious, specifically they belonged to the Pentecostal Church, an offshoot of Christianity known for its conservative approach to life and strong emphasis on biblical teachings. David was an intellectually gifted young man. He managed to get into the prestigious Virginia Tech, one of the renowned technical universities in the United States, where he majored in computer engineering. This shows that he had an aptitude for the technical sciences and analytical thinking. After graduation, he managed to get a job with a very important defense contractor, working for Lockheed Martin and later Northrop Grumman. Both of these companies are among the largest and most respected arms and aerospace companies in the world, which meant that David had a solid career and a steady income. So he was not an uneducated or marginalized man. On the contrary, he had the outward appearance of a successful professional. In terms of his character and personality, David gave off a rather quiet and withdrawn impression to those around him. He was not the type of person who sought social contact or liked to present himself in public. According to the recollections of some acquaintances, he was introverted, almost quirky. He spoke little, and when he did, it was often about technical matters or religious topics. Now to Louisa Ann Turpin née Robinette, who was born on the 24th day of May 1968 in West Virginia. Louise also came from a religiously conservative Pentecostal church background. Her childhood and adolescence were influenced by the strict rules and moral values that this church upheld. Unlike David, however, Louise did not have a college education or career aspirations. Rather, she was brought up with the traditional notion of a woman's role to look after the home and family. Louise and David met at Princeton High School in Princeton, West Virginia. Their relationship quickly developed, and in the year 1985 they were married in the small town of Pearisburg, Virginia. And here comes the first disturbing detail. At the time of the wedding, David was 23 years old, while Louise was only 16. Yes, you heard right. Louise was still a minor at the time of the wedding. In some U.S. states, it is possible to marry at such a young age with parental consent, but this age difference alone and the fact that an adult man married a 16-year-old girl may indicate some imbalance in their relationship. Both spouses were initially deeply religious. They even believed that God had called them to have many children. They considered it their calling. This view is consistent with some conservative Christian trends that support large families as a blessing from God. Over time, however, their relationship to their faith has changed. According to the accounts of relatives, the Turpins later left the church altogether. They began to experiment with other lifestyles and interests. Relatives even mentioned that they were interested in the occult, witchcraft, and even allegedly practiced swinging, i.e., exchanging partners with other couples. This radical departure from their original religious beliefs indicates a profound change in their values and way of life. In terms of the dynamics of their relationship, Louise was very submissive to David. She came across as having no will of her own and merely following her husband's instructions. At the same time, she was an active part of everything that happened in the household. She was not just a passive observer. She was as responsible for the actions that took place in the family as David was. Mr. and Mrs. Turpin had 13 children together, 10 daughters and 3 sons. All of the children were born between the years 1988 and 2015, which means that Louise bore children for almost 30 years. This is an extraordinarily long period and shows a systematic approach to starting a large family. An interesting detail is that all the children had names beginning with the letter J. The oldest child was named Jennifer and was born in the year 1988. The youngest child was born in the year 2015. This naming pattern, where all the children have names beginning with the same letter, is not uncommon in large families, but in this case it adds another layer to the overall atmosphere of control and uniformity that the parents exerted over the children. The age range of the children was really wide. When the case came to light, the youngest child was only 2 years old, while the oldest was already 29. Yes, that's right. The oldest child was actually an adult of almost 30. This is a key fact because it shows that the abuse was not only of underage children, but also of adult offspring who were still living under the control of their parents. Some of the children looked much younger than they actually were due to chronic malnutrition and lack of care. Their growth was stunted, their cognitive development delayed. Imagine a situation where rescuers find a person who looks 12 years old, but is actually 20. That was the reality of some of Turpin's children. The Turpins created a very specific family structure that was based on complete isolation from the outside world. It was not a family that had normal contacts with neighbors, relatives, or the community. David and Louise systematically separated their children from any outside influence. The family moved several times. They lived in Texas, specifically in Fort Worth, where, according to the memories of their eldest daughter, Jennifer, life initially seemed relatively normal. However, as time passed, the situation began to deteriorate. In the year 2010, the family moved to California for David's job. They eventually settled in the town of Paris in Riverside County, an area known for its warm climate and relatively quiet suburban character. The house in Paris was a typical suburban home, nothing to arouse suspicion from the outside. Neighbors noticed that the family was odd. The children rarely went out, and when they did, it was usually at night. Some neighbors later recalled that they occasionally saw the children working in the garden, but always at night or at dusk, never during the day. That in itself was unusual. There was a strict hierarchy within the family. David was the head of the household and had the final say in everything. Louise was his right-hand woman and did his bidding. The older children were sometimes forced to supervise the younger siblings and even punish them if they did something wrong. This system created an atmosphere of fear and total control where no one could trust anyone else. Children did not go to school. Parents claimed to educate them at home, which is legal in California if you meet certain conditions. But in reality, there was no real education going on. The children had no textbooks, no structured learning, no contact with teachers or other children. They were locked up at home, with no access to information about the outside world. Social isolation was almost total. Children had no friends, could not visit relatives, could not go out to play. Even contact with extended family was very limited or completely forbidden. Grandparents and other relatives occasionally expressed concern, but David and Louise prevented them from having access to the children or kept contact to a minimum. This isolation served to ensure that the parents had absolute control over what the children knew, what they saw, what they heard, and who they spoke to. The children did not know their own rights. They did not know that the way their parents treated them was illegal and immoral. They thought that this was somehow the normal life of every family. They had no comparison, no access to information that would help them understand that their situation was extremely abnormal. David and Louise also controlled access to technology. The children had no phones, no or very limited access to the internet. If any technology was in the house, it was under close parental supervision. The children were not free to communicate with the outside world or seek help. This combination of factors, physical isolation in the home, social isolation from the community, educational isolation from schools and peers, technological isolation from information, created a perfect trap from which it was almost impossible to escape. Children lived in a kind of parallel reality where only their parents made the rules and where there was no one to protect or help them. The house in Paris was literally a prison for the Turpin children. The windows were constantly covered with heavy curtains and blinds, so that very little daylight came in. The children lived in constant darkness, which had a devastating effect on their perception of time and their psyche. Imagine never seeing the sun properly, never knowing whether it was day or night, spring or winter outside. This lack of natural light caused the children to have pale, almost translucent skin. Their circadian rhythms were disrupted, and they suffered from vitamin D deficiency. The rooms in the house were dirty and unkempt. The carpet was covered with stains, and there was rubbish, clothes, and miscellaneous items lying on the floor. The smell in the house was unbearable, according to the statements of the police officers who carried out the intervention, a combination of dirt, urine, feces, and ubiquitous mold. The bathrooms were in a terrible state, non-functional or extremely dirty. Children were not able to wash properly or maintain basic personal hygiene. As far as contact with the outside world was concerned, the children were only allowed to go out once or twice a year at most, and even when they were allowed to go out, they were only allowed to walk around the garden of the house, never leaving the property. These rare outings took place mostly at night, when there was minimal chance of being seen. Neighbors who occasionally spotted the children outside noticed that they looked pale, emaciated, and frightened. They often moved in a line behind each other like soldiers on the march, which seemed bizarre and disturbing. The children had no friends and had never visited a park, a shop, a cinema, or a restaurant. They never experienced normal childhood pleasures like a birthday party at a friend's house, a school trip, or a sports game. Their world consisted only of the few rooms in the house where they were confined. They knew nothing else. Some of the younger children didn't even remember what the outside world looked like because they had virtually never seen it. As far as education was concerned, the children received only minimal instruction. Parents occasionally gave them some textbooks or workbooks, but there was no structured curriculum. The children had to learn on their own, without guidance, without explanation, without support. Many of them learned the basics of reading and writing, but their knowledge was extremely limited. They had no idea of history, geography, science, or mathematics beyond the very basics. They did not know current events, who the president was, or how the world around them worked. Food was used as a tool of control and punishment in the Turpin home. The children received food irregularly in small quantities and of very poor quality. A typical meal for a child, for example, was a single peanut butter sandwich divided among several siblings, or a bowl of instant rice. That was all for the day. Sometimes they received nothing at all for several days. The children suffered from chronic hunger that was so intense it drove them to desperate acts. They would hide bits of food under their mattresses or in corners of their rooms to have something for later. When parents discovered these supplies, punishment followed. Some children tried to sneak into the kitchen at night and take something to eat. If they were caught, there were harsh consequences. Ironically, while the children were starving, the parents were buying large quantities of food, which they stored in the house. The children saw the cupboards and the fridge full, but were not allowed to take anything. They had to watch their parents eat while they themselves were starving. This psychological cruelty was perhaps even worse than the hunger itself. Imagine seeing food, smelling it, but knowing that if you take even a bite, you will be brutally punished. The consequences of this starvation were devastating. All the children were extremely malnourished and emaciated. Their bodies did not look normal. They had thin limbs, bulging bellies typical of malnutrition. Their hair was falling out. They had bad teeth or missing teeth altogether. Their bones were brittle due to lack of calcium and other nutrients. Some children weighed as much as a child 10 or 15 years younger should weigh. Water was also strictly rationed. Children were not allowed to drink whenever they wanted. They had to beg for permission to drink, and were often denied. Chronic dehydration caused headaches, dizziness, kidney problems, and other health complications. Their skin was dry and flaky, their lips chapped. Hygiene was virtually non-existent. Children were allowed to bathe only once every few months, sometimes only once a year. They had no access to basic hygiene items such as soap, shampoo, toothpaste, or a toothbrush. They could not brush their teeth regularly, which led to extensive dental problems and infections. Their hair was greasy, tangled, and full of parasites. Clothes were dirty, torn, and often inappropriate for their size. The girls had no access to sanitary products during menstruation, causing them not only physical discomfort, but also enormous psychological strain and humiliation. They had to cope with towels or rags that they could not wash properly. And now I come to perhaps the most shocking part of this story. The children were not just locked in the house, they were literally chained up. David and Louise used chains, ropes, and locks to chain the children to the furniture. Most often the children were chained to beds. They used strong chains that were wrapped around the child's wrists or ankles and then attached to the bed frame with padlocks. These chains were so short that the children could hardly move at all. They couldn't get up. They couldn't stretch. They could barely sit up. They would lie or sit in a very restricted position for hours, sometimes for days or even weeks. The chains were tight and heavy. They chafed the skin on their wrists and ankles, causing bruises, abrasions, and cuts. Some children had permanent scars in these areas from repeated strapping. The pain from these injuries was constant, but the children could not defend themselves or relieve themselves in any way. When the children were handcuffed, they could not go to the toilet. They had to urinate or poop where they lay. This caused them not only physical discomfort, but enormous psychological trauma and humiliation. Imagine being a teenager or an adult and having to wet the bed because you have no other option. The smell and the filth were unbearable, but the children had to stay in it until their parents weaned them. Parents used restraint as a punishment for any infraction. When a child took food, when they talked too loudly, when they showered longer than they were allowed, or even for no particular reason, just because they felt like it. Handcuffing became a routine part of life in the home. At first the parents used ropes, but when one of the children managed to untie the knot and free herself, they switched to chains with locks. This improvement to their system shows the thoughtfulness and systematic nature of their cruelty. This was not impulsive violence. It was carefully planned and executed abuse. Some children were chained up during the day. They had to spend time like this while their siblings were allowed to move around the room. This unequal treatment created another layer of psychological suffering. The children did not know why some were chained and others were not. They lived in constant fear that next time it would be them. At night, when children were chained, they could not escape in case of fire or other danger. They were completely helpless and dependent on the will of their parents. This lack of control over their own bodies and safety caused deep psychological traumatization. The chains became a symbol of their captivity. When the police later conducted a search, they found these chains and locks as direct evidence of abuse. Photographs of these chains attached to beds went around the world and shocked the public. People could not believe that in the 21st century in a developed country, parents could treat their children like this. Children lived in constant fear of being chained. This fear dominated every aspect of their lives. They tried to be as quiet as possible, as obedient as possible, as invisible as possible, just to avoid chains. But the reality was that no matter how hard they tried, they were still chained. There was no way to satisfy their parents enough to avoid this punishment. This physical confinement had profound psychological consequences. The children felt worthless, helpless, and completely under the control of their parents. They lost their sense of autonomy and human dignity. They were reduced to objects with which their parents could do whatever they wanted. Physical violence was a daily reality in the Turpin home. Both David and Louise used various methods and tools to physically punish their children. One of the most common forms was beating with a paddle. These were not some light spankings. They were hard, painful blows that left bruises and marks all over the children's bodies. Parents beat their children on their backs, on their butts, on their thighs, wherever it suited them. They used other objects besides the paddle: shoe straps, wooden spoons, plastic hoses, anything they had on hand that could cause pain. The blows were applied with such force that the children screamed in pain, but nobody cared about their screams. On the contrary, if they screamed too loudly, they were given more blows for making noise. Hair pulling was another common form of physical violence. Parents grabbed children by their hair and pulled it so hard that entire strands were pulled out. The children had bald spots on their heads where their hair had fallen out from repeated pulling. This pain was intense and immediate, serving as a quick way to discipline the child. Slapping was also common. Hard slaps to the face causing swelling of the cheeks, bruising around the eyes and mouth. Sometimes the blows were so severe that children's noses would bleed or their lips would be busted. Imagine living in an environment where any parent could hit you in the face at any time without you knowing why. Choking and suffocation was one of the most dangerous forms of physical violence. Both David and Louise sometimes grabbed children around the neck and squeezed them until the child could not breathe. The children at these times felt that they were dying, that this was the end. The panic and terror of not being able to breathe traumatized them perhaps more than the pain itself. And then, just when they thought they couldn't take it anymore, their parents let them go. This form of violence was not just a physical assault. It was a demonstration of absolute power over the children's lives. Pushing and throwing children was another method. Parents threw children against walls, against furniture on the floor. The children hit hard surfaces, causing further injuries. Bruises, scrapes, sometimes fractures or dislocations. The child's body was thrown like an object, not like a living, feeling being. Kicking was also part of the physical violence. Parents kicked children in the ribs, in the stomach, in the back. These blows caused internal pain, made breathing difficult, and left large bruises. Some of the kicks were so strong that the children could not breathe properly or straighten up for days. Pinching and scratching was a lesser form of physical violence, but no less painful. Parents pinched children severely on their arms, legs, and faces. They dug their nails so deep into the skin that they left bleeding wounds. These small but numerous attacks were a constant reminder that their bodies were not their own. Forced positions were another form of physical abuse. Children were forced to stand in strange, uncomfortable positions for long hours. For example, standing with their hands above their heads, or holding a squat, or standing on one leg. If they moved or fell, punishment followed. These forced positions caused extreme muscle pain, cramps, and exhaustion. Sleep deprivation was used as a form of physical punishment. Children had to stay awake all night or were woken up every hour. Chronic sleep deprivation had devastating effects on their health, growth, and cognitive function. They were constantly exhausted, disoriented, and unable to think clearly. The psychological abuse was perhaps even worse than the physical abuse because it left invisible but deep scars. The children lived in a constant state of fear and anxiety, never knowing what lay ahead. Death threats were a common tactic. Parents told children they would kill them if they didn't listen. They said things like, "I'll kill you and no one will notice," or "I can kill you and no one will care because no one likes you anyway." These threats were not empty. The children knew their parents were capable of extreme violence, so they believed these threats. They lived in fear for their lives every day. Threats of punishment were also constant. Parents constantly threatened that if the children did anything wrong, they would be punished. But the rules kept changing. What was okay yesterday was now grounds for punishment. This unpredictability created an atmosphere of constant uncertainty. Children never knew what was safe to do or say. Humiliation and ridicule were the daily routine. Parents told children they were stupid, ugly, worthless, incompetent. They were told that they were useless, that no one else would want them, that they should be grateful that they were allowed to live at all. This verbal aggression systematically destroyed the children's self-esteem and self-worth. Gaslighting, the manipulation of reality, was another form of psychological abuse. Parents told children that things that happened never actually happened. They denied their own actions, accusing children of making things up or being crazy. This manipulation caused children to doubt their own memory, perception, and sanity. Isolation as punishment was used not only physically, but also psychologically. Some children were locked in rooms alone for long periods, days, weeks. No contact with anyone, no stimulation, no communication. This social deprivation caused deep psychological damage. Feelings of abandonment and despair. Being forced to watch sibling abuse was a particularly cruel form of psychological violence. Children had to watch their siblings being beaten, humiliated, or tormented. They could not intervene, they could not help, they just had to sit and watch. This helplessness and the guilt of not being able to do anything traumatized them as much as the physical abuse itself. False hopes were also a tool of psychological abuse. Parents sometimes promised their children something nice, a trip out, a special meal, a gift. The children looked forward and hoped, but what was promised never happened. This repeated disappointment taught them that they had nothing to look forward to, that hope was an illusion. Religious manipulation was also present. Even when the parents later left the church, they still used religious concepts to manipulate the children. They told them that God was punishing them for their sins, that they deserved to suffer, that it was God's will. This perverted interpretation of religion added another layer of guilt and shame to their suffering. The prohibition of emotions was another form of psychological abuse. Children were not allowed to cry, nor were they allowed to show anger, sadness, or joy. They had to be neutral at all times, without emotion, like robots. If they showed any emotion, they were punished. This suppression of emotions had devastating effects on their psychological development and their ability to process their feelings in a healthy way later in life. Information control was a key tool parents used to maintain their power over their children. Unless children knew there was another way to live, they could not imagine escape or help. The ban on communication with the outside world was absolute. Children were not allowed to talk to neighbors, not allowed to talk to relatives, not allowed to talk to anyone outside the family. If it ever happened that a visitor came, which was extremely rare, the children had to stay in their rooms quietly and were not allowed to go out. Visitors often did not even know how many children lived in the house. When the family occasionally contacted relatives, communication was strictly controlled. Children could only speak in the presence of their parents, who monitored every word. If a child said something the parents did not like or tried to imply that something was wrong, punishment followed later. Children learned to say only what their parents wanted to hear, or rather, not to speak at all. Letters and written communication were also censored. If children wrote letters to grandparents or other relatives, their parents read and approved them beforehand. They often dictated what they should write. Children were not free to express their thoughts or feelings. Some letters that children wrote and attempted to send were destroyed by their parents or never sent. Access to telephones was either completely forbidden or extremely restricted. Children were not allowed to own phones, they were not allowed to call anyone. If they were ever allowed to use the phone, which was maybe once a year or even less, they had to call in the presence of their parents, who listened to every word. They couldn't call the police. They couldn't call a helpline. They couldn't contact anyone who could help them. The internet was also under strict control. Some older children were allowed to use the computer occasionally, but only under parental supervision. They were not free to browse websites. They could not search for information about abuse or how to get help. Parents monitored browser history, and if they found anything inappropriate, punishment followed. Social media was banned. Children did not have accounts on Facebook, Instagram, or any other platform. They couldn't interact with peers online. They couldn't share their experiences. They couldn't seek support. They were completely disconnected from the digital world that is a natural part of life for most young people. Media censorship was also strict. Children were not allowed to watch the news. They were not allowed to read newspapers or magazines. Parents controlled what films or TV programs children could watch. Mostly, it was children's films or religious programs. Children had no access to information about current events in the world, about politics, about social problems. Books were also censored. Children only had access to a very limited selection of books, mostly children's stories or religious texts. They were not allowed to read books about teenagers, about growing up, about relationships, or anything that might open their eyes to how abnormal their situation was. Educational materials were also controlled. Although parents claimed to educate their children at home, in reality they gave them very basic textbooks and no supplementary information. Children could not learn about civil rights, child protection laws, or where to go for help. Information about the body and sexuality was completely taboo. Children received no explanation about growing up, about body changes, about reproduction. girls didn't know what to expect when they got their periods. They had no information about healthy relationships or what was inappropriate adult behavior towards children. Language control was also a form of information control. Parents determined what words children could use, what they could talk about. Some topics were forbidden. For example, talking about the past, about how things used to be, or about the future, about what they wanted to do when they grew up. This complex control of information created an information vacuum in which children lived. They did not know that their situation was abnormal. They did not know that there were laws to protect them. They did not know that there were people and organizations that could help them. They were trapped not only physically but mentally, in a reality created and controlled by their parents. On January 14, 2018, something happened that the Turpin parents never expected. One of their daughters, then 17-year-old Jordan Turpin, decided to take the desperate step of running away from home. Jordan wasn't actually the oldest of the children, but she was one of the bravest. She had been planning to run away for a long time, but had never had the courage to actually do it. Jordan had an old cell phone she found in the house. It wasn't active, it didn't have a plan or the ability to make calls, but it worked as a camera. A few months before her escape, she had started secretly taking pictures of evidence, pictures of her siblings chained to their beds, pictures of the filthy conditions in the house, pictures of the emaciated bodies of her brothers and sisters. She hid these photos on her phone because she knew that if she managed to get out, she would need evidence. People might not believe her if she just told them what was going on. She needed something tangible. It took months to plan the escape. Jordan had to wait for the right moment when her parents wouldn't be too attentive. She talked about her plan with her sister, a year younger, who encouraged her to try. They both knew the risk was huge. If her parents caught her, the punishment would probably be the worst she'd ever experienced. On the morning of the 14th of January, an opportunity presented itself. The parents were busy and not paying as much attention to the children as usual. Jordan decided to give it a try. Her heart was pounding so hard that she felt everyone in the house must hear it. Her hands shook as she carefully opened the window in her room. Every sound seemed incredibly loud. The creak of the window, the rustling as she crawled out. When her feet touched the ground outside, she froze for a moment. She was outside. She really was out of the house. The sun was blinding her. She wasn't used to such bright light. It took a moment for her eyes to adjust. She looked around, trying to get her bearings. She could see the neighbors' houses, the street, the cars. Everything looked so normal, so different from inside her house. But now came the hardest part. She had to find help. She didn't know exactly where to go. She had never been out alone before. She didn't know the neighborhood. She didn't know the neighbors. She started walking down the street, trying to look as normal as possible, but it was hard. She was skinny, pale, wearing dirty clothes. People who passed her looked at her strangely. Jordan was looking for someone she could trust. She saw several people, but was afraid to approach them. What if they didn't trust her? What if they sent her back home? What if they called her parents instead of the police? These thoughts paralyzed her with fear. Finally, she saw someone who looked friendly. It was a neighbor who was just coming out of his house. Jordan walked up to him, heart pounding. The words that came out of her were simple but desperate. I need help. I need water, and I need to call 911. The neighbor was confused. He saw before him a skinny, frightened girl who looked more like 12 than 17. At first, he thought she might have run away from home after an argument with her parents. Something that happens. But something in her eyes, in her voice, told him it was more serious. Jordan was holding the old phone with the pictures. She started to explain to him, My parents are keeping us imprisoned. I'm from the Turpin family from that house over there. There are 13 of us kids and our parents are abusing us. I have evidence. She pulled out her phone and showed him some photos. The neighbor was shocked by what he saw. Pictures of chained children, emaciated bodies, dirty rooms. It couldn't be true. But it was. He knew right away he had to act fast. He told Jordan to wait and ran to his house to call the police. At the same time, he brought her the water she desperately needed. While she waited for the police, Jordan was in constant suspense. What if her parents found out she was missing? What if they were looking for her? What if they find her before the police arrive? Every car that came down the street caused her to panic. What if it's them? Her younger sister, who stayed in the house, also took a risk. When she found out Jordan had actually escaped, she decided to follow her. She also climbed out the window and went looking for her sister. She wanted to be with her. She wanted to support her. She also wanted to hear about what was going on in the house. Dispatcher 911 took a call from a neighbor at 10:05 in the morning. Initially, it sounded like a routine case of domestic violence or a runaway minor. But when the dispatcher started asking questions and getting details, she quickly realized something much more serious was going on. Jordan spoke directly to the dispatcher. Her voice was shaky, but she was determined. She described what was happening in the house: the strapping, the starvation, the beatings. She said there are 12 other siblings in the house, some of whom are chained up right now. The dispatcher assured her that help was on the way and tried to keep her calm. The Paris Police Department dispatched units immediately. They knew every minute could be crucial. If the parents found out the children had run away, they could start destroying evidence, or worse, harming the remaining children. The first police vehicle arrived on the scene less than 10 minutes after the call. The officers first spoke with Jordan and her sister, who were waiting outside. Jordan showed them photographs on her phone. The officers were immediately alarmed by what they saw. They knew they had to act quickly, but also with caution. One of the officers later described that when he saw the photos, he couldn't believe his eyes. He had seen a lot of things in his career, but this was something else. The pictures of the handcuffed children looked like something out of a horror movie, not real life in 21st century California. The commander on the scene immediately called for backup. They needed more troops, they needed medics, they needed social workers. At the same time, they had to make sure the parents couldn't escape or hurt the remaining children. Officers approached the Turpin home. They knocked on the door. There was panic inside. David and Louise knew something was wrong. They may have already discovered that some of the children were missing. When they opened the door and saw the police, they tried to look normal, as if everything was fine. "Hello, we're from the Paris Police Department. We received a report of possible child abuse at this address. May we come in?" one of the officers said. David and Louise tried to refuse, claiming it was a misunderstanding that their children were fine, but the officers had Jordan's statement and photographs as grounds for credible suspicion. They had the right to enter. When the officers entered the house, they were struck by the smell of dirt, urine, and decomposition. The house was dark. The place was a mess. They started going through the rooms looking for the children. The first children they found were in the living room. They sat quietly, scared, emaciated. They looked more like skeletons covered in skin than living children. The police officers tried to calm them down, telling them they were here to help, that they were safe now. They found other children in the bedrooms. Some of them were actually chained to their beds, just as Jordan described. One girl was chained to the bed with a padlock on a chain around her wrist. She was sitting in her own feces, scared to death. The police immediately began freeing the children. One of the officers had to use a pair of pliers to cut the chain, because David and Louise refused to give up their keys. When the chain fell off, the girl began to cry, perhaps in relief, perhaps in fear of what would come next. In all, they found 11 children in the house. 2 were already outside with Jordan. The age of the children shocked them. Some looked like young children, but when the officers asked their ages, they discovered they were teenagers or even adults. The oldest child they found in the house was 29 years old, but looked no more than 15 due to extreme malnutrition. Emergency services arrived within minutes. The paramedics began examining the children immediately. They took vital signs, checked for injuries, and assessed the state of dehydration and malnutrition. Each child needed immediate medical attention. The evacuation of the children was systematic. Each child was carefully taken from the house to the ambulance. The police and paramedics spoke to them gently, trying to calm them down. The children were confused and frightened. They had never been in an ambulance before, never spoken to so many strangers at once. David and Louise were arrested on the spot. The officers handcuffed them and took them to the police cars. Neighbors who had begun to gather around the house watched the scene in shock. They saw one emaciated child after another coming out of the house. They couldn't believe that this was happening right next to them, and they didn't know it. Media crews began arriving within the hour. News of the case spread quickly. Reporters filmed police going through the house, children being loaded into ambulances, parents being taken away in handcuffs. The children were taken to Corona Regional Medical Center. The medics there had been forewarned that a group of severely abused and malnourished children were arriving, but they were still shocked by what they saw. A special ward was created in the emergency room just for the Turpin children. Each child was given their own team of doctors and nurses. It started with a detailed medical examination. Vitals were the first priority. Blood pressure, pulse, temperature, oxygen saturation were measured. Most children had abnormal readings, low blood pressure due to dehydration, rapid heart rate, low body temperature. Weight and height were recorded and compared with normal values for their age. The results were alarming. All children were well below normal weight. Some weighed 20 to 30 kilograms less than they should. Their height was also below average because chronic malnutrition had stunted their growth. Blood tests revealed severe nutrient deficiencies. The children had extremely low levels of vitamins, minerals, and protein. Some had anemia, low blood sugar, and electrolyte disorders. These laboratory results confirmed that the children were suffering from long-term starvation. Physical injuries were documented. Doctors photographed bruises, scars, and chain wounds on wrists and ankles. X-rays revealed old fractures that had healed on their own without medical treatment. Some of the bones were improperly fused, causing chronic pain and restriction of movement. The teeth were in disastrous condition. Most children had extensive tooth decay, and some had teeth that were completely rotten or missing. Gums were inflamed and infected. Doctors knew that extensive dental care would be needed. The skin was dry, scaly, and infected in places. The children had rashes, fungal infections, and abrasions that had become infected. Hair was greasy, tangled, full of parasites. The nurses had to carefully wash and treat them. The children were given intravenous fluids to compensate for the dehydration. This had to be done very carefully because rehydrating too quickly could cause further health complications. Slowly and gradually, their bodies began to get back into balance. Food was another problem. The children could not get normal food right away because their bodies were not used to regular food. Doctors had to start with small portions of easily digestible food and gradually increase the amount. This process is called refeeding and must be carefully monitored to avoid the dangerous refeeding syndrome. The psychological examination began almost immediately. A team of psychologists and psychiatrists came to the hospital to begin assessing the mental state of the children. They knew that the psychological trauma was likely to be even more profound than the physical injuries. The children were extremely frightened and distrustful. They had never spoken to psychologists or therapists before. They didn't understand why people were asking them so many questions. Some children were almost unable to communicate. They spoke very quietly, used a limited vocabulary, and were unable to express their feelings. Psychologists observed signs of post-traumatic stress disorder, hypervigilance, lethargy, nightmares. Some children had dissociative symptoms. They seemed disconnected from reality, as if they were not fully present. Others showed signs of severe depression or anxiety. Social workers began documenting the case for legal purposes. They took photographs of injuries, recorded children's statements, and collected medical reports. All of this evidence would be needed for a lawsuit against the parents. During the first 24 hours in the hospital, over 50 medical professionals attended to the children. Each of them was deeply affected by what they saw. Many of them later said that this was the worst case of child abuse they had ever encountered. Medical documents became a key pillar of the case. A team of doctors at Corona Regional Medical Center created detailed reports on each of the 13 children. These reports contained hundreds of pages of detailed information about their medical conditions. Each child had his or her own comprehensive medical profile. Doctors recorded accurate BMI, body mass index, values. For all 13 children, the BMI was well below the healthy range, in a category referred to as severe malnutrition. Some children had BMIs consistent with the starvation levels seen in famine-affected areas. Endocrinologists found severe hormonal disorders. Growth hormone was at abnormally low levels in most of the children, which explained their stunted growth. The thyroid gland was not functioning properly in many of them, affecting metabolism, energy, and body temperature. In adolescent girls, puberty was either delayed or completely arrested due to lack of body fat and nutrition. Cardiological examination revealed heart problems. Some children had a slow heart rate, known as bradycardia, which is the body's defensive response to prolonged starvation. The heart muscle was weakened in some children due to lack of protein. Echocardiographic examinations showed shrunken heart chambers and reduced heart function. Neurological examination yielded worrying results. MRIs of the brain in some children showed atrophy, shrinkage of brain tissue. Long-term malnutrition and lack of stimulation had a measurable impact on brain structure. Some areas responsible for memory, learning, and emotional regulation were significantly smaller than they should be. Cognitive tests revealed varying degrees of intellectual disability. Some children had IQs significantly below average, not because of congenital disorders, but because of lack of nutrition, education, and stimulation. Their brains were not getting what they needed to develop normally. Doctors have documented delayed speech development, memory problems, and an inability to solve simple problems. Orthopedic examinations revealed bone deformities. Rachitis, a disease caused by vitamin D deficiency, was present in several children. Their bones were soft and crooked. The spine of some children had an abnormal curvature due to poor nutrition and lack of exercise. The hip joints of some were poorly developed. X-rays showed growth arrest lines in the bones, visible streaks where bone growth had temporarily stopped during periods of extreme starvation. These lines were like the rings of a tree, documenting a period of the worst abuse. Doctors could use these lines to estimate when and how often children suffered the worst starvation. Gastroenterologists documented problems with the digestive system. The children's stomachs were shrunken as they adapted to the small amount of food. The intestinal flora was disturbed. Some children had stomach ulcers caused by stress and poor nutrition. The livers of several children showed signs of damage. Immunological tests showed a weakened immune system. The white blood cell count was abnormal because the body did not have enough nutrients to produce them. The children were susceptible to infections and often had illnesses that do not occur in healthy children. Ophthalmological examination revealed vision problems. Some children had retinal damage due to vitamin A deficiency. Night blindness was present in several children. The eyelids of some children had inflammation and infection due to lack of hygiene. Audiological tests showed that some children had hearing problems, probably due to chronic ear infections that were never treated. Eardrums were scarred from repeated infections. Dermatological reports documented skin conditions. Eczema, fungal infections, bacterial infections, abscesses were all present. The skin of some children showed signs of scurvy, a disease caused by vitamin C deficiency usually seen only in 18th century sailors. Forensic photographers spent several days documenting every corner of the Turpin home. They took thousands of photographs that became key evidence in the case. The photos of the chains were perhaps the most shocking part of the evidence. The photographers documented the chains exactly as they were found, attached to the bed frames. Close-ups showed the type of locks used to secure the chains. They were industrial padlocks, almost impossible to break without tools. The photographs showed how short the chains were, just 30 to 50 centimeters, allowing almost no movement. Macro photographs of the locks revealed wear and tear that indicated prolonged use. The surface of the locks was scratched and worn, showing that they had been used repeatedly over a long period of time. The chains had biological traces on them, blood, skin, hair, that were later analyzed and linked to specific children. Photographs of the beds showed soiled mattresses. Stains from urine, feces, and blood were visible and documented. These photographs showed that children were left restrained for so long that they had to urinate and poop in bed. Photographs of the doors documented the locking mechanisms. Some doors had locks installed from the outside, which meant that children could be locked in their rooms. Other doors had bolts or chains added. Photographers documented every lock, every deadbolt, every control mechanism. Windows were also photographed. Many had bars or were secured from the outside, so that they could not be opened from the inside. The hinges were heavy and dark, effectively blocking out the light. Photographers documented how little light penetrated inside even during the day. The kitchen was photographed in detail. Shelves full of food, canned goods, boxes of cereal, snacks were all documented. These photos created a stark contrast with the starving children. The refrigerator was full, but a lock was installed on the door. The photographs of this lock on the fridge became an iconic symbol of parental cruelty. The bathrooms were in terrible condition and every detail was captured. The toilets were clogged and non-functional. The bathtubs were full of dirt. Mirrors were broken or missing. No toiletries were visible. No soap, no shampoo, no towels. My parents' bedroom provided a shocking contrast. Their room was relatively clean and orderly. They had a comfortable bed, a working television, personal belongings. The photographs showed that the parents lived in very different conditions from their children. The children's rooms were crowded. Several children shared one small room with minimal furniture. The photos showed piles of dirty clothes, garbage, and personal belongings strewn everywhere. There were no toys, no books, no signs of a normal childhood. Photographs of the entire house from the outside showed how normal the house looked from the street. It was a typical suburban house, nothing suspicious. This contrast between the exterior facade and the interior horror was important in explaining why the neighbors had no idea. The forensic team also photographed evidence that the family occasionally went on outings, but only the parents. They found photos from Disneyland, from Las Vegas, from various tourist spots. These photos were of David and Louise, often with one or two children, but never all of them. These photos showed that the parents had the means and freedom to travel, while most of the children stayed cooped up at home. Photographs of the renewal of marriage vows were also found. David and Louise renewed their marriage vows several times in Las Vegas, dressed as Elvis and Priscilla Presley. The children at these ceremonies acted as props, dressed in identical dresses or suits, standing in line, looking terrified. These bizarre photos went viral when they were published in the media. Interviewing the children was the hardest part of the investigation. Forensic psychologists and detectives specializing in child abuse conducted dozens of hours of interviews with each child. Jordan, the girl who escaped, was the first and most communicative. Within days, she gave an extensive statement lasting many hours. She described in detail the regime in the house, the rules the children had to follow, the punishments for breaking those rules. She explained how the abuse had gotten progressively worse over the years. She spoke of specific incidents. She described how she once saw her sister chained to her bed for 6 weeks, without a break. She described how children were forced to stand up all night as punishment. She told how their parents threatened to kill them if they told anyone about what was happening. Jordan also explained why the escape took so long. She talked about her fear, about not knowing if anyone would believe her, about being afraid of what would happen to her siblings if her parents caught her. Her account was incredibly detailed and consistent, which gave it a high level of credibility. Her younger sister, who followed her on the run, gave a similar account. She confirmed everything Jordan said and added her own recollections. She described the psychological manipulations the children were subjected to, how their parents told them that the outside world was dangerous, that no one else would want them, that they would be worse off in foster care. The older adult children had the longest memories and could describe how the situation unfolded. The oldest daughter, Jennifer, who was in her 30s at the time of rescue, described how life was relatively normal when the children were young. She explained how things got progressively worse. First gentle controls, then isolation, then physical abuse. Jennifer described how parents used religion as a tool of control in the early years. They quoted the Bible to justify their actions. They spoke of discipline and obedience as divine commandments. Later, when they left the church, the religious justification disappeared, but the violence continued. Middle children described a hierarchy among siblings. They explained how the older children were sometimes forced to supervise the younger ones and even punish them. This coercion caused tremendous guilt and disrupted sibling relationships. They described how parents deliberately pitted children against each other to prevent unity and possible rebellion. The younger children had a more limited ability to express themselves, but their statements were just as powerful. Some could barely speak, and their vocabulary was very limited. But when the psychologists showed them dolls and toys and asked them to show what was happening, the children demonstrated hitting, strapping, locking up. One of the younger children drew a picture of a house with big locks on the doors and windows. Another child drew a picture of a bed with chains. These children's drawings became part of the evidence, a frighteningly simple but powerful testimony to their experience. All the children described chronic hunger as one of the worst parts of their ordeal. They talked about how they thought about food constantly, how they daydreamed about food, how they planned what they would eat if they could. They described the physical pain of an empty stomach, the weakness, the dizziness. Children also described emotional abuse. They talked about how their parents told them they were stupid, ugly, worthless. Some children repeated these insults about themselves as if they believed them. "I'm stupid. I suck." These internalized messages showed the depth of psychological damage. Several older children described how they thought about running away but were afraid. They explained the various plans they had devised, waiting until their parents were asleep, trying to break a window, writing a letter, and throwing it over the fence to the neighbors. But the fear was always too great, until Jordan found the courage to actually do it. Investigators recorded hundreds of hours of testimony. Each statement was meticulously documented, transcribed, and analyzed. The consistency across the testimony of the different children was remarkable. Although each child had his or her own perspective, the basic facts were consistent. Forensic linguists analyzed the way the children spoke. Their vocabulary was limited, their grammar simple, their ability to express complex ideas reduced. This language delay was further evidence of neglect and lack of education. The psychologists also documented how the children reacted during the interviews. They were extremely frightened of authority figures, unable to make eye contact. Some trembled when they talked about their parents. Others dissociated. Their gaze was lost, as if they were no longer present. These reactions were consistent with severe trauma. Importantly, none of the children defended their parents. There was no Stockholm syndrome, no emotional attachment to those who had abused them. All the children clearly expressed that they were afraid of their parents and did not want to go back home. This clarity was unusual in child abuse cases and very strong for the prosecution. On January 18, 2018, just 4 days after the children were rescued, the first formal charges were brought against David and Louise Turpin. Riverside County District Attorney Mike Hestron called a press conference to present the scope of the charges. In total, 49 counts of charges were filed against each of the parents. That meant a total of 98 charges for both spouses. The scope of these charges was staggering and reflected the systematic nature of their crimes. The first and most serious charge was torture. Under California criminal law, torture is defined as the intentional infliction of cruel or extreme pain and suffering on another person for the purpose of revenge, extortion, persuasion, or for any sadistic reason. The prosecution argued that chaining, starving, and repeatedly beating children met this definition. Each child represented a separate count of torture, resulting in 13 counts of torture for each parent. False imprisonment was another serious charge. This offense involved the unlawful restriction of the personal liberty of children. The prosecution argued that the children were held in the house against their will, were not free to leave, and were physically prevented from moving. 13 counts of this charge were again brought, one for each child. Abusing and endangering a dependent adult was a specific charge involving the 7 oldest children, who were adults at the time of the rescue. California law recognizes that adults who are dependent on caregivers due to physical or mental disabilities can be victims of abuse just as much as children. Because these adult children were so damaged and dependent on their parents, they fell into this category. Child abuse and endangerment charges were brought for 6 minor children. These charges cover a wide range of behavior, from physical abuse to neglect to exposing children to dangerous conditions. The prosecution had extensive evidence for each of these counts. Additional related charges were added to these main counts. David Turpin also faced charges of lewd or lascivious acts against a child under the age of 14. This charge suggested that sexual abuse may have occurred in addition to physical and psychological abuse, although the details of this particular charge were not disclosed to protect the victim. If found guilty on all counts of the indictment, David and Louise faced life in prison plus 47 years to life in prison. Some of the charges carried the possibility of the death penalty, although the prosecutor later announced that the death penalty would not be sought. Bail was set at $12 million for each spouse, a total of $24 million. This astronomical sum ensured that the parents would remain in custody throughout the trial. In setting bail, the judge stated that the amount reflected the seriousness of the crimes and the danger the defendants posed to society. The first court hearing was held on January 23, 2018. David and Louise appeared in court for the first time since their arrest. Media from around the world followed their arrival in the courtroom. The two defendants looked markedly different than in previous family photographs. David wore an orange prison jumpsuit, looking tired and defeated. Louise looked even worse. She was thin, pale, and blank-eyed. They both looked down and avoided eye contact with anyone in the courtroom. The judge read them the charges. The entire process of reading the 49 counts of the indictment took nearly an hour for each of them. With each charge, specific acts and specific victims were specified. The audience in the courtroom, including the journalists, was visibly shaken by the scope of the charges. When asked to comment on the charges, both responded with a silent, "Not guilty. Not guilty." Their voices were barely audible. The judge had to ask them to answer louder. The defense was in a difficult position from the start. The court-appointed lawyers for David and Louis knew that the evidence against their clients was overwhelming. Photographs, medical reports, the testimony of 13 children, all of it created an almost impenetrable wall of evidence. David Turpin's defense initially hinted at a possible mental illness defense strategy. Their argument could have been that David suffered from some unrecognized mental disorder that prevented him from recognizing that his actions were wrong. They had a psychiatric evaluation of David performed. However, after a series of examinations, the psychiatrists concluded that although David may have had certain personality traits or disorders, he was fully capable of recognizing the difference between right and wrong. He knew that his actions were illegal, which was evident in the way he carefully hid the abuse from the outside world. Thus, the mental illness defense was not viable. Louise Turpin's defense had even less room for maneuver. Their only possible argument was that Louise was herself a victim of David, that she was under his control and manipulation. They could have argued that she was a submissive wife who feared her husband and acted under duress. However, this argument was weak. The evidence clearly showed that Louise was an active participant in the abuse. The children testified that Louise beat, restrained, and humiliated them as much as David did, sometimes more. Video footage from home surveillance cameras seized by the police showed Louise actively abusing the children. She couldn't be presented as just a passive victim. The pre-trial hearings went on for months. Both sides debated the admissibility of evidence, how to question witnesses, the logistics of a possible trial. Prosecutor Mike Hestrin was determined to get justice for the children. He has publicly stated that this case represents immeasurable suffering and that his office will do everything possible to ensure that the parents are punished accordingly. During these months, the media intensively followed every court hearing. Press conferences after each hearing were packed with journalists from around the world. The Turpin case became an international sensation, a symbol of the worst possible parental failure. The hearing on February 22, 2018, was pivotal. The prosecutor presented some of the evidence before the judge to show that there was sufficient reason to proceed with the prosecution. He presented photographs of the house, medical reports, portions of the children's statements. The judge, after hearing the evidence, decided that the case would go to trial. He stated that the evidence was disturbing and compelling, and that there was more than sufficient reason to believe that the accused had committed the crimes. During the summer and fall of 2018, preparations for the main trial continued. The defense requested several postponements, arguing that they needed more time to prepare because of the complexity of the case. The judge granted some adjournments but made it clear that the trial must go forward. In October 2018, signs began to emerge that the defense was considering a plea bargain. Attorneys for David and Louis began negotiating with the prosecutor about the possibility of their clients pleading guilty in exchange for a specific sentence, rather than risking a trial and the possibility of an even harsher sentence. The negotiations were complex. The prosecutor did not want to be seen as too lenient in such a serious case. At the same time, he had to consider the interests of the victims, the children who would have to testify during a long and traumatic trial. Public testimony could be another traumatic experience for them. The children's representatives, the lawyers appointed to represent the interests of the 13 siblings, were included in the discussions. They consulted with the children, those who were able to express their views about their wishes. Some of the children wanted to be able to testify publicly. They wanted to confront their parents. Others were terrified of the possibility of seeing their parents again and would rather avoid the process. On February 22, 2019, exactly 1 year after the crucial pretrial hearing, David and Louise Turpin appeared in the courtroom for one of the most important hearings in their case. The atmosphere in the courtroom was tense. The public benches were packed. Journalists, children's rights advocates, social services representatives, and even some relatives of the Turpin family. Security measures were heightened. Prosecutor Mike Hestron stepped forward and announced that a plea and sentence agreement had been reached. David and Louise Turpin have agreed to plead guilty to 14 counts of the indictment, including torture, false imprisonment, and abuse of dependent adults. When the judge asked David Turpin to plead to each count of the indictment, David quietly repeated, "Guilty. Guilty." 14 times he said that word. With each utterance, he seemed to sink further into himself. Louise followed suit. She also pleaded guilty to the 14 counts of the indictment. Her voice was even quieter than David's. On some points she seemed to stutter as if she couldn't get the words out. Under the terms of the plea agreement, David and Louise were to receive a sentence of 25 years to life. That meant that, in theory, they could apply for parole after 25 years. But given the nature of their crimes and their ages, it was clear that they were likely to spend the rest of their lives in prison. Sentencing was scheduled for April 26, 2019. The day was full of emotion and suspense. Before the sentencing, the victims were given the opportunity to submit victim impact statements, statements about the impact of the crime on their lives. Several older children decided to take advantage of this opportunity. One of the daughters, who was an adult at the time of the rescue, was the first to speak. She stood outside the courtroom, her voice shaking, but determined to tell her story. She described how her parents had destroyed her childhood, how they had taken away the possibility of a normal life, friends, education. She spoke of the chronic fear she lived in every day. Finally, she said she forgave her parents, not for them, but for herself, so she could move on. Her words were powerful, and many people in the courtroom cried. Another daughter came forward with similar testimony. She spoke of the physical pain she endured, but even more so of the psychological harm. She said that even though she was now free, she still felt the chains. She still wakes up with nightmares. She is still afraid of dark rooms, of hunger, of locks. She expressed hope that in time she would learn to live normally. One of the sons submitted a written statement, which was read by the attorney representing him. In the statement, he described how he felt helpless, how he tried to protect his younger siblings but could not. He expressed anger towards his parents for what they had done, but also gratitude towards those who had saved them. Jordan, the girl who escaped and saved her siblings, also made a statement. She spoke of the courage she had to find to escape. She said that the worst part was neither hunger nor chains, but the feeling that no one would ever come to help. She expressed hope that her story would inspire other victims of abuse to seek help. After these statements, State Representative Mike Hestron took the floor. He made a powerful closing argument about why David and Louise deserve the harshest possible punishment. He described the systematic nature of their cruelty, the length of the abuse, the number of victims. He argued that this is not a case of parents who made a mistake or lost control. This is a case of deliberate, long-term torture of their own children. The defense also had the opportunity to speak. David Turpin's lawyer said his client accepts responsibility for his actions and is sorry. He described David's difficult childhood and religiously strict upbringing as possible factors that contributed to his behavior. He asked for the court's mercy. Counsel for Louise Turpin similarly argued that his client was partly influenced by David, that she was a submissive wife in a patriarchal relationship. He also mentioned that Louise suffered from health problems, and that prison would be particularly hard on her. The judge then gave David and Louise themselves the opportunity to speak. David stood up and, with his head bowed, said, "I am sorry for what I have done to my family. I ask for forgiveness." His words were brief and unemotional. Louise said something similar, but added, "I loved my children. I never meant to hurt them." These words elicited loud reactions in the courtroom. Some people gasped in disapproval, others openly expressed disbelief. Finally, Judge Bernard Schwartz took the stand. His statement was long and detailed. He went through every aspect of the case, every crime, every victim. He said he had seen many cases of child abuse in his long career, but this one was unprecedented in its scope and cruelty. The judge then handed down his sentence. David Allen Turpin was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Louise Anna Turpin was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The terms of the plea agreement were modified. Instead of 25 years to life, which theoretically would have allowed parole, the judge decided on the harshest possible sentence. He explained that the nature and extent of the crimes required nothing less than life without the possibility of parole. This meant that David and Louise would spend the rest of their lives in prison. David, who was 58 years old at the time of sentencing, and Louise, who was 50 years old, would never be free. When the sentence was passed, David and Louise showed no visible reaction. They sat motionless, looking down. When the prison guards escorted them from the courtroom, neither looked back. Outside the courthouse, prosecutor Mike Hestron called a press conference. He declared that justice had been served and that the 13 siblings could now begin the healing process, knowing that their parents would never be able to hurt anyone again. The road to physical recovery has been long and difficult for the Turpin children. Hospital care was just the beginning. Real rehabilitation took months and years. Nutritional rehabilitation was one of the first priorities. Nutritionists created individual plans for each child. They could not just be put on a normal diet. Their bodies were not ready. They started very slowly, with liquid nutritional supplements that contained a balanced mix of proteins, carbohydrates, fats, and vitamins. Each child was given small portions 6 to 8 times a day instead of 3 large meals. Solid foods were gradually introduced. It started with soft, easily digestible foods such as porridge, yogurt, mashed potatoes, and chicken soup. Nutritional therapists watched how the children reacted to each new type of food. Some children had digestive problems. Their stomachs and intestines had to relearn how to process normal food. It was also necessary to teach the children a healthy relationship with food. Some children tended to overeat when they finally had unlimited access to food. They hoarded food in their rooms, hiding it under their beds or in cupboards, because they were always afraid of losing it. The therapists had to help them understand that food would always be available, that they didn't have to worry. Other children had the opposite problem. They refused to eat. After years of food-related abuse, they had such negative associations that eating itself caused anxiety. They needed therapy aimed at overcoming these fears and creating new, positive associations with food. Physiotherapy was key to restoring muscle strength and mobility. Years of inactivity, restraint, and inadequate nutrition had left the children's muscles weak and atrophied. Some children were unable to walk longer distances without gasping for breath. Others had problems with fine motor skills. They could not hold a pencil or fasten their buttons properly. The physiotherapists started with very basic exercises: stretching to increase flexibility, light strengthening exercises to build muscle mass, cardiovascular activities to improve endurance. Each child had a personalized program based on their specific needs and abilities. Even just walking was difficult for some children. Their bones and joints were so weakened that normal activities caused pain. They had to use walkers or crutches, gradually learning to walk properly again. The process was slow and frustrating, but with time and patience the children made progress. Orthopedic care was necessary to address the bone deformities. Some children needed orthoses, special support devices for the legs or spine. Others needed surgical interventions to correct the most severe deformities. Surgery was riskier because of the general poor health of the children, but in some cases necessary. Dental care was extensive and painful. Children had to undergo many visits to the dentist. Some teeth were so damaged that they had to be extracted. Others needed root canals, fillings, crowns. Several older children eventually received partial or full dentures. The process of treating the teeth took months and was traumatic for the children, because they were already afraid of doctors and painful procedures. Dermatological treatment focused on skin problems. Infections had to be treated with antibiotics or antifungals. Chronic eczema and other skin conditions required long-term care with medicated creams and lifestyle changes. Some chain scars were so deep that plastic surgery was considered, although most children chose to leave the scars as a reminder of what they had survived. Ophthalmic care included glasses or contact lenses for many children. Some needed special treatment for retinal damage. Regular checkups were necessary to monitor their vision, which may have been permanently damaged. Gynecological care for girls was a sensitive issue. Older girls who had never had proper care during puberty and menstruation needed comprehensive examinations. Some had irregular cycles or other hormonal problems caused by malnutrition. Doctors tried to approach these examinations as gently as possible, knowing how traumatic a physical examination can be for victims of abuse. Immunizations were another priority. The children were not properly vaccinated, so they had to receive a series of vaccinations against common diseases. Their weakened immune systems meant they were particularly vulnerable to infection, so vaccinations were critical to protect them. The psychological damage was perhaps even deeper and more lasting than the physical. All 13 siblings were diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder. PTSD manifested itself in different ways in each child. Flashbacks were common. Children suddenly reliving traumatic memories, feeling chains around their wrists, hearing their parents screaming, seeing their siblings' faces in pain. These flashbacks could be triggered by a variety of stimuli: the sound of clanging metal objects, the sight of a locked door, even the smell of certain foods. Nightmares plagued the children almost every night. They woke up in the middle of the night screaming, sweating, terrified. Some children were afraid to go back to sleep because they knew what awaited them. The sleep disturbances were so severe that many children needed medication to get rest. Hypervigilance, excessive alertness, caused children to be constantly on guard. They couldn't relax even in a safe environment. They were constantly scaling the room, looking for escape routes, watching the movements of the people around them. This constant vigilance was exhausting and prevented them from functioning normally. Anxiety disorders manifested themselves in many ways. Generalized anxiety caused constant worry about everything: about food, about safety, about the future. Panic attacks came suddenly, causing rapid heartbeats, shortness of breath, a sense of impending death. Social anxiety made it difficult to interact with new people. Depression was also common. Some children suffered from deep sadness and hopelessness. They felt worthless, damaged, unable to lead normal lives. They had thoughts of self-harm or suicide. Antidepressants and intensive therapy were necessary to keep them safe. Difficulties in establishing relationships were one of the most painful consequences. Children were taught throughout their lives not to trust anyone, especially not authority figures or adults. This deep distrust stayed with them even after they were rescued. They had tremendous difficulty trusting their foster parents, therapists, teachers, anyone. Attachment was a foreign concept to them. They had never experienced a secure, loving bond with a caregiver. They didn't understand what it meant to have someone care for them unconditionally. Some children became overly clingy, desperately seeking love and acceptance. Others withdrew and refused any close contact. Relationships between siblings were also complicated. Although they had been through the same hell together, their experiences differed. Some siblings were close and supportive of each other. Others had complicated feelings: guilt for not being able to protect younger siblings, anger at older siblings who sometimes had to punish them at the behest of their parents. Romantic relationships were almost unimaginable for older children. They had no role models for healthy relationships. Their only relationship model was the toxic and abusive relationship of their parents. Learning what a healthy relationship was, how to communicate, how to set boundaries, it was like learning a whole new language. Emotional regulation was another huge challenge. Children never learned how to express or process their emotions in a healthy way. Some exploded with anger at the slightest frustration. Others suppressed all emotions and appeared emotionally flat. Learning to recognize, name, and express emotions in a healthy way required years of therapy. Therapeutic approaches had to be carefully tailored. Traditional talking therapy did not work well for children with such limited vocabulary and ability to express themselves. Therapists used art therapy, music therapy, play therapy, methods that allowed children to express themselves non-verbally. EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, was used to process traumatic memories. This technique helps the brain reprocess traumatic memories to make them less distressing. Some children responded well to this method, while others found it too intense. Cognitive behavioral therapy helped children identify and change negative thought patterns. They learned to recognize irrational beliefs, such as "I am worthless" or "no one can like me," and replace them with more realistic thoughts. Group therapy with other victims of abuse provided a sense that they were not alone. Hearing the stories of others who had gone through similar experiences helped to reduce feelings of isolation and shame. At the same time, however, it had to be carefully moderated because listening to others' traumatic stories could be triggering. Medication was necessary for many children. Antidepressants helped with depression and anxiety. Anxiolytics provided short-term relief from panic attacks. Sleeping medications helped with nightmares and insomnia. Finding the right combination and dosage of drugs took months of trial and error. Integration into normal society was perhaps the most challenging part of the whole process. The children had to cope with a huge amount of new experiences and information all at once. Placement in foster care was carefully planned. Social workers tried to find foster parents who had experience with traumatized children and were willing to provide the intensive care the children needed. Older children who were now adults were given the option of living independently with support, or also in foster care if they preferred. Siblings were initially kept together in smaller groups. The foster care system tried to minimize further trauma by not separating them from the only people they knew, each other. Multiple siblings were placed with the same foster family when possible. Foster parents received special training on how to care for severely traumatized children. They learned how to recognize triggers, how to respond to panic attacks, and how to provide reassurance and safety. They were warned that the process would be long and difficult, and that they would face many challenges. The first days and weeks in their new homes were overwhelming for the children. Everything was new. Soft beds, clean rooms, their own clothes, toys, unlimited access to food and water. Some children initially saw this as a trick or a trap. They feared that all this would be taken away, that they would be punished for enjoying it. Learning basic life skills was necessary. Children did not know how to use a washing machine, how to cook a meal, how to manage money, how to use public transport. All these everyday skills that most people take for granted had to be taught step by step. Personal hygiene required patient teaching. Children were not used to showering daily, brushing their teeth, taking care of their hair. They had to learn why hygiene was important and how to do it properly. Some children initially refused to shower because water and the bathroom were associated with traumatic memories. Buying clothes was an experience in itself. The children had never been to a store, never picked out their own clothes. Being able to choose what they wanted to wear was incredibly liberating, but also stressful for them. They had trouble making decisions because they had never made any decisions before. The educational programs were tailored to each child's individual needs. Younger children were enrolled in special education programs where they could catch up with their peers. Teachers were informed of their situation and trained on how to work with traumatized students. Programs were created for older children and adult siblings to receive the equivalent of a high school education. Some started with the very basics, learning to read and write at primary school level, even in their 20s or 30s. The pace was slow, but progress was visible. The community college offered scholarships to several older siblings. Those who showed interest and ability were able to begin studying various fields of study. Jordan, the girl who ran away, expressed interest in studying social work so she could help other victims of abuse. Social skills were taught through group activities and therapy sessions. Children were taught how to start a conversation, how to maintain eye contact, and how to recognize social cues. They were taught about personal boundaries, that they had the right to say no, that their body was their own. Cultural integration was also a challenge. Children missed out on years of popular culture, technological developments, social change. They didn't know about smartphones, social media, contemporary music, or movies. They had to learn quickly about a world that everyone else considered normal. Financial literacy was taught to older children and adults. They had never had money before. They didn't know how banks, credit cards, accounts worked. They were taught about budgeting, saving, responsible spending. The community support was invaluable. Local organizations offered free services, dental care, legal advice, tutoring. Volunteers stepped up as mentors, helping the children navigate their new world. Media attention was double-edged. On the one hand, it raised awareness of the case and brought support and donations. On the other hand, it invaded the children's privacy and made it difficult for them to attempt a normal life. The children's lawyers had to fight to protect their identities and locations. Financial support came from many sources. A victims fund was set up to which people from all over the world contributed. This money was used for therapy, education, healthcare, and basic needs. The trustees of the fund ensured that the money was used responsibly and for the benefit of the children. When news of the Turpin case hit the media in January 2018, the reaction was immediate and intense. People around the world were shocked by what they heard. How is it possible that something like this was happening in modern times, in a developed country, in an ordinary neighborhood? The American public was particularly shocked. This case made headlines on all the major news outlets. CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, ABC, all of them broadcast continuous coverage of the case. Talk shows and morning shows devoted entire episodes to discussing what happened. Reactions exploded on social media. Twitter was flooded with the hashtags #TouchYourTurpin case and #TouchYourTurpin children. People shared their shocked reactions, expressing sympathy for the children and anger towards the parents. Many wrote that they couldn't sleep after learning about the details of the case. Facebook groups formed spontaneously where people discussed the case, shared updates, and organized ways to help the children. Some groups had tens of thousands of members within days. People shared their own experiences of abuse or neglect, which created space for important conversations about domestic violence. Instagram was flooded with pictures of 13 yellow ribbons, symbols of support for 13 siblings. Celebrities and influencers shared posts about the case, raising awareness among their millions of followers. Some offered financial support or other forms of help. Reddit communities created extensive threads analyzing every aspect of the case. Users discussed the legal aspects, the psychological impact, the systemic failures. Some threads had thousands of comments and millions of views. The international reaction was equally strong. British media such as the BBC and The Guardian carried extensive coverage. Australian, Canadian, European newspapers had the case on their front pages. People around the world expressed disbelief and sadness. In Germany, the case sparked a debate about homeschooling, which is strictly regulated or banned there. Many have argued that the American case shows the dangers of inadequate oversight of families who educate children at home. In the UK, the differences in child protection systems have been debated. British social workers discussed how such a case would have been handled in their system and whether it could have been caught earlier. In Japan, where domestic abuse cases are also a problem, the Turpin case sparked a national conversation about how to better protect children. Japanese media compared the case to their own neglect and abuse cases. Religious communities around the world were also forced to reflect on the case. The Pentecostal church, to which the Turpins originally belonged, issued a statement condemning their actions and stressing that true faith never justifies abuse. Other religious groups have discussed how to prevent the abuse of religion as a pretext for control and violence. Psychologists and psychiatrists around the world expressed professional opinions in the media. They tried to explain to the public how something like this could happen, what psychological factors might have played a role, and how long it would take for children to heal. Academics wrote articles analyzing the case from different perspectives: sociological, criminological, psychological. Universities organized panel discussions about the case and its broader implications for society. Artists responded to the case in different ways. Poets wrote about the pain and resilience of children. Painters created works inspired by their story. Musicians composed songs dedicated to victims of abuse. Art became a way to process collective shock and grief. Ordinary people around the world felt a personal connection to the case. Parents hugged their children tighter and expressed gratitude for normal, loving families. Survivors of abuse themselves felt validation of their experiences and inspiration in Jordan's courage. One of the most controversial issues that surfaced was, how could it be that 13 children were abused for decades without any intervention from the authorities? That question has sparked intense scrutiny of the child protection system in California and across the United States. It became clear that the Turpin family had had contact with Child Protective Services in the past. When they lived in Texas, neighbors once called CPS with concerns about the children. A social worker visited the house but found insufficient evidence to intervene. David and Louise were able to convince the worker that everything was fine. This revelation sparked a wave of criticism. How could a professional have missed the signs of abuse? Why weren't more thorough checks carried out? Critics argued that the system had failed these children at the most basic level. CPS in California faced even more criticism. Although there are no records of anyone directly reporting suspected abuse in California, many argued that there were warning signs that should have been picked up. The family was registered as a homeschool under the name Sandcastle Day School. California law requires registration of homeschools, but does not require any regular inspections or evaluation of the children's progress. Critics have pointed to this huge loophole in the system. The debate over homeschooling has become very heated. On one side were organizations supporting the right of parents to educate their children at home, arguing that adding regulations would be an infringement of freedom. On the other side were groups calling for stricter oversight, arguing that children have a right to a quality education and protection. Some lawmakers have proposed new laws requiring regular inspections of families who educate children at home. These proposals have sparked heated debate. Supporters of homeschooling argued that it would be unconstitutional and that the vast majority of homeschooling families do a great job. Opponents argued that protecting children must be a priority over parental rights. The healthcare system also faced questions. How is it possible that children have never been to a doctor? In California, vaccinations are mandatory for school children, but homeschools have exemptions. This loophole allowed the Turpin children to never be examined by a healthcare professional who could detect signs of neglect or abuse. There have been calls for mandatory medical exams for all children, regardless of whether they attend school or are educated at home. Pediatricians supported these proposals, arguing that regular medical checkups are crucial not only for children's health, but also as a safety net for detecting abuse. Neighbors also faced criticism and self-criticism. Several have publicly expressed regret that they did not intervene sooner. One neighbor told the newspaper that he saw the children looking weird and skinny, but never said anything. Another neighbor mentioned that he heard strange noises from the house at times but never called the police. This sparked a national conversation about community responsibility. Campaigns with slogans like, "If you see something, say something," were launched across the country. People were encouraged to trust their instincts and report suspicious behavior, even if they weren't sure. At the same time, there was discussion about how difficult it is to spot abuse from the outside. Experts explained that abusive parents are often very skilled at masking their actions. They isolate the family, create a facade of normality, and manipulate the system. Neighbors and the community cannot know what is going on behind closed doors unless there are obvious signs. CPS funding has become a political issue. It has come to light that child protection departments across the country are chronically underfunded and overburdened. Social workers often have hundreds of cases at a time, making it impossible to do a thorough job on each one. The Social Workers Union issued a statement explaining the systemic problems. They pointed to lack of resources, inadequate training, and bureaucratic obstacles. They called for increased funding and reforms to the system. Politicians responded in different ways. Some have proposed increasing budgets for child protection. Others proposed reforms aimed at better coordination between different agencies: schools, health, police, social services. There was general agreement that the system needed change, but disagreement about what exactly that change should look like. The Turpin case quickly became the subject of extensive media coverage outside of traditional news coverage. Documentary makers, journalists, and authors saw the story as important material for deeper investigation. ABC News produced a special 2-hour documentary program called The Turpin 13 Family Secrets Exposed, which aired in November 2018. The documentary featured interviews with investigators, neighbors, experts, and reconstructions of the events. It received high ratings and critical acclaim for its sensitive treatment of the subject. Diane Sawyer of ABC News conducted a special interview with two older sisters, Jordan and Jennifer, that aired in November 2021. This was the first time any of the victims spoke publicly about their experiences. The interview was emotionally powerful and was watched by millions of viewers. The sisters spoke of their courage, the healing process, and their hopes for the future. Investigation Discovery, a television channel specializing in true crime, produced an episode of their series Evil Lives Here dedicated to the case. This episode focused on the psychology of abusive parents and how they were able to maintain their facade of normalcy. Oxygen Network produced a documentary exploring how the case fits into the larger context of domestic abuse and abuse in America. It included interviews with psychologists, lawyers, and other victims of similar crimes. The My Favorite Murder podcast, one of the most popular true crime podcasts, dedicated an episode to the Turpin case. The hosts discussed the details of the case and the broader implications for society. The episode had millions of downloads. Crime Junkie, another very popular podcast, also covered the case. Their episode focused on Jordan's courage and how her decision to run away saved the lives of all of her siblings. Several podcasts specializing in psychology and trauma have produced episodes analyzing the psychological aspects of the case. The Psychology podcast with Dr. Scott Barry Kaufman discussed the long-term effects of childhood trauma and the healing process. Journalists have begun working on books about the case. Several investigative journalists gained access to court documents, police reports, and interviews with people close to the case. These books promised the most comprehensive view of the case. Jennifer Tisdale, a journalist specializing in crimes against children, wrote a book called House of Horrors: The Shocking True Story of the Turpin Family, which was published in 2019. The book provided a detailed chronology of the case and an analysis of how such a system failure could have occurred. Academic publications also began to examine the case. Professional journals in the fields of psychology, social work, and criminology published articles using the Turpin case as a case study. These articles explored topics such as recognition of abuse, intervention, and the long-term effects of extreme neglect. YouTube channels dedicated to true crime have produced hundreds of videos about the case. Some were well-researched and informative, others were sensational and speculative. In total, videos about the Turpin case have had tens of millions of views. TikTok, although a controversial platform for such a serious topic, has seen thousands of videos discussing the case. It was through these short videos that the younger generation learned about the case, leading to debates about the appropriateness of discussing trauma on an entertainment platform. Bloggers and online writers created extensive articles and series of posts. Some blogs focused on the legal aspects, others on the psychological, and still others on systemic failures. These online resources have become important sources of information for people seeking a deeper understanding of the case. Film school students and aspiring documentary filmmakers have produced independent documentaries about the case as part of their projects. Although these films have not had wide distribution, they have contributed to the ongoing conversation about the case. Television drama series began to consider adaptations of the story. Several producers expressed interest in creating a dramatized version of the events. However, this raised ethical questions about the appropriateness of dramatizing real-life trauma for entertainment. Lawyers representing the Turpin children have expressed concern about some of the media coverage. They sought to protect the children's privacy and ensure that the media respected their healing process. They issued a statement asking the media to be sensitive and responsible in their coverage. Ethical journalists discussed how to properly cover such cases. Organizations such as the Society of Professional Journalists have issued guidelines emphasizing the importance of protecting victims, avoiding sensationalism, and focusing on systemic issues rather than just shocking details. The Turpin case has also become part of educational materials. Universities used the case as a case study in social work, psychology, criminology, and journalism courses. Students analyzed different aspects of the case and discussed what could have been done differently. The Turpin case shows us how critically important early intervention is. Had someone intervened earlier, many years of suffering for these children could have been prevented. This knowledge holds important lessons for all of us. The first key lesson is that each of us has a role in society as a guardian of children's well-being. We are not just passive observers of life around us. We have a moral, and in many cases a legal, responsibility to notice the children around us and to respond when something is wrong. Warning signs almost always exist, but they require attention and a willingness to see them. In the Turpin case, there were many potential warning signs. Children who were not seen out in the daytime, pale and gaunt appearances on rare sightings, odd behavior by parents, isolation of the family from the community. Each of these signals alone may not indicate abuse, but a combination of multiple signals should raise concern. It is important to understand that we do not have to be absolutely certain that something bad is happening to report it. Child protection professionals are trained to investigate and assess situations. Our role is not to be detectives or judges. Our role is to report concerns and have professionals make an assessment. Fear that we might be wrong or that we might cause problems for an innocent family often prevents people from reporting concerns. But it is important to remember that the cost of silence can be devastating. It is better to report concerns that turn out to be unfounded than not to report actual abuse. Anonymous reporting is possible in most jurisdictions. People who fear retaliation or confrontation can report concerns anonymously. This should remove one of the main barriers to reporting. Authorities have a huge responsibility to improve their systems of detection and intervention. The Turpin case has exposed critical gaps in the system: inadequate oversight of homeschooling, lack of mandatory medical exams, lack of interagency coordination. Interagency communication is key. The health system, education system, police, and social services must share relevant information. A child who has never been to a doctor and never been to school should automatically raise an alarm somewhere in the system. Technology today makes it possible to create databases that could capture such cases. Regular checks on families educating children at home could be one solution, albeit a controversial one. These checks would not need to be invasive. They could involve simple interviews with children, basic health checks, and assessments of educational progress. The goal would not be to harass good families, but to create a safety net for children at risk. Training for professionals who work with children needs to be better and more frequent. Teachers, doctors, police officers, social workers all need to be trained to recognize the subtle signs of abuse and neglect. Abuse doesn't always leave visible bruises. It often manifests itself in behavioral changes, developmental delays, fear of adults. A culture of reporting must be encouraged and protected. Professionals who report concerns about children should never face negative consequences for acting in good faith. On the contrary, they should be encouraged and rewarded for putting children's safety first. The Turpin case reminds us that child abuse is a real and widespread problem. It is not something that only happens in the movies or in other countries. It is happening here, now, perhaps even in our own neighborhood. And there are organizations working tirelessly to protect children who need our support. Child Help is one of the leading organizations in the U.S., providing assistance to victims of child abuse. They operate the National Child Abuse Hotline, which is available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. This line receives calls from children, parents, professionals, and concerned citizens. Each year, this line saves countless lives. Support for such organizations can take many forms. Financial donations are, of course, welcome and needed, but not everyone has the means to contribute financially, and that's okay. There are other ways to help. Volunteering is invaluable. Many organizations need volunteers for a variety of roles, from administrative work to fundraising to working directly with children after appropriate training and vetting. Donating your time can have just as much impact as donating money. Raising awareness is another important way to support. Sharing information about child abuse on social media, talking about the issue with friends and family, educating yourself about the warning signs, all contribute to creating a society that better protects children. Advocating for policy change is also a form of support. Contacting your elected representatives, voicing support for laws that protect children, attending public hearings on child protection issues. These actions can lead to systemic changes that protect more children. CASA, Court-Appointed Special Advocates, is an organization that trains volunteers to represent the interests of abused and neglected children in the court system. These volunteers become the voice of the child, ensuring that their needs and wishes are heard by the judges who decide their future. Becoming a CASA volunteer is a deeply meaningful way to directly help children. Local shelters and centers for abused children exist in many communities. These organizations provide immediate help to children who have just been removed from dangerous situations. They need donations of clothing, toys, school supplies, as well as financial support for their programs. Prevention programs are just as important as intervention programs. Organizations that teach parents healthy parenting skills, provide support for families under stress, offer anger management programs. These programs can prevent abuse before it starts. Supporting survivors is a long-term commitment. Organizations that provide therapy, educational support, mentoring, and other services for adult survivors of childhood abuse help these people build healthy, productive lives. An investment in survivors is an investment in the future. Perhaps the most important lesson from the Turpin family story is the power of mindfulness and action. Jordan Turpin, a 17-year-old girl who found the courage to run away, saved not only herself, but her 12 siblings. Her story is proof that one person can make a difference. Small acts of courage can have a huge impact. Jordan didn't do anything heroic in the traditional sense. She didn't enter a burning building or stop a criminal. She simply climbed out a window and asked for help. But that simple act changed 13 lives forever. Each of us can be that person who makes a difference. We don't have to be professional investigators or social workers. We just need to be people who care, who notice, and who are willing to act. Trusting our own instincts is important. If something looks or feels wrong, it probably is. Our intuition often picks up on things that our conscious mind hasn't fully recognized. When you have a feeling that something is not right with a child or family, don't be afraid of that feeling. A child who seems sad, scared, or distant. A child who is wearing inappropriate clothing for the weather, perhaps covering an injury. A child who seems hungry or thirsty. A child who is unreasonably fearful of adults. A child who has frequent absences or explanations that don't make sense. These can all be signals. But it is equally important to understand that abuse can look different. Not all abused children are obviously neglected or hurt. Some are well-dressed and clean, but bear the invisible scars of emotional or psychological abuse. Some are socially isolated, which is itself a form of abuse. Talking to a child when you are concerned can be helpful, but must be done carefully. We should not conduct an interrogation or ask leading questions. Simple, open-ended questions such as, "How are you?" or "Is everything all right?" can sometimes open doors. But if a child doesn't want to talk, we shouldn't push. Instead, we should report our concerns to professionals. Everyone should know contact numbers and resources. In the U.S., the National Child Abuse Hotline is 1-804-2224. There are similar lines in other countries. These numbers should be widely known and easily accessible. Online resources provide information on how to recognize abuse, how to report concerns, and how to support a child who confides in you. Websites such as childhelp.org, preventchildabuse.org, and others offer free educational materials. Creating safe spaces for children is something each of us can do. Being an adult that children trust, that they can confide in, that will listen to them without judgment, that can be a lifesaver for a child in need. Teachers, coaches, neighbors, relatives, we can all be that safe adult. Talking about these topics with your own children is also important. Children should know that they have a right to safety, that their body is their own, that no adult should hurt them or force them to do things that make them uncomfortable. They should know the difference between good secrets, a surprise birthday party, and bad secrets, something that scares or hurts them. Supporting survivors when abuse is revealed is critical. A child who finds the courage to tell about abuse needs to be believed, supported, and protected. Sadly, many children who confide are not believed or are blamed. This is secondary traumatization that can be just as damaging as the original abuse. The Turpin family story reminds us that even in the darkest situations, there is hope. 13 siblings who have known nothing but hell now have a chance at a normal life. Their journey will be long and difficult, but they now have something they have been denied for so long: freedom, support, and the chance to build their own future. This case should be a catalyst for change. It should inspire us to be better neighbors, more thoughtful citizens, stronger advocates for children. It should motivate us to support reform of the systems that have failed these children. And finally, this case should be a reminder of the resilience of the human spirit. Despite years of the worst abuse imaginable, the Turpin children have survived. They found the strength to carry on, the hope for a better future, the courage to start again. Their story is tragic, but also inspiring. So the next time you see something that concerns you, a child who looks sad, a family that seems too isolated, a situation that just doesn't feel right, don't hesitate. Trust your instincts. Call the appropriate hotline. Talk to someone who can help. It may be nothing, but maybe, just maybe, you'll save a life. Thank you for following this difficult but important story with me. If this case has affected you, please consider supporting organizations that help children. And remember, each of us has the power to make a difference. Sometimes we just need to notice, care, and act. If you liked the video, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and turn on your doorbell for more videos about real-life criminal cases. And most importantly, be that voice for the voiceless. Thanks for watching and see you in the next video.